Can you tell us about the beginning of voguing, where it started and where it came from?
Sure. Well, the very beginning of Vogue, I mean, to break it down. Voguing started in the started in Harlem, and the way it started was it started out as drag queen balls. And what I mean by drag queen balls is back in the 40s, 50s, I've even heard it's gone back to the 20s. It was men that used to come, and they used to have these little ballroom sessions which were underground, and it was for them to get dressed up. It was their moment to shine and to live. Now what the guys would do back then is they would get dressed up in boas, dresses, feathers, beads, diamonds, anything they could that became extravagant, and they would battle each other on who looked the best. And that's where ballroom first began. Voguing first began in prison, which started actually in Rikers Island in Harlem, or Manhattan actually, the city. It started because in prison men were not allowed to have porno magazines. They weren't allowed to have anything that showed women. So the safest thing that they were allowed to have were modeling magazines, which featured women in bathing suits, women in shorts, women with low tops or whatever, and that was the only way they were able to have anything that dealt with women at that time. From that, the men in prison, the gay men, found these magazines, and they started copying the women in the magazines, the poses that the women were doing in the magazines. After a couple of them, I guess, studied the magazines, they would have these mini battles in prison, and at that time it was called pose-offs. They would have pose-offs with each other, and basically what that consisted of was 2, 3, 4, 5, however many people wanted to join in. They would go side by side, opposite sides, and the patron number 1 would do a pose. The number 2 would do a pose to top what that one did. And basically it became a battle of poses, who was doing the best poses. After that happened, it moved out into the streets of Harlem. The same people that had started it got out of prison, ended up on the streets of Harlem, and from there they brought it to the ballroom scene, which was at the time drag queens and over-the-top men getting dressed up in these gowns and stuff like I was saying earlier. So now it wasn't just about drag queens. Now it was about drag queens and men that were flamboyant and were posing. So it became a battle of the ones walking in the dresses and the big feather pieces, and then there was the posers. Now the posers started in these underground, not that it started in the underground, but that's where it took its flight. That's really where it became solidified in our culture. After this happened, a bunch of children, or what we call the next generation, caught on to it and was watching it. This generation that caught on to it was the generation that was going to school for dance. This was the generation that was in gymnastics. This was the generation that was taking karate. This is the generation that was into taekwondo and dance. And anything that you could think of to do with the human body. Children were doing this. Breakdancing, whacking, voguing became the next big thing to come up. And actually, just so that you know this, voguing actually came out before breakdancing. That's how long ago this has been. Now these kids that were coming out and watching this and seeing this, and they started adding these little tricks to it, well then posing became voguing. Now what was the difference between that? Posing is simply a pose. What the kids changed was going from pose to 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 pose. They added all different types of movements and different contortions of the body. That's how voguing became what it was. But now let me not confuse you, because it didn't start out as new way. The first thing that happened with voguing out of posing was what we call today old way. But old way was actually the first style of dance with movement, so at that time it was considered the new way. I know this is a little confusing, but follow me. Old way today used to be the new way years ago, until the kids with gymnastics, until the kids in karate, until the kids with stretch and circus-like attributes were able to stretch themselves, pull themselves, and do all different types of things. They came into the picture, which was us, my generation. My generation came forward and started doing it faster, quicker, more precise, literally to the beat and to the music. Not saying it wasn't happening before, but we upped the ante. We made it bigger, better, brighter. And once that came in, we were now considered the new way, and the old new way became old way. So, just so that you now know the history, where old way started and how it became old way, and now where new way is, and why it's still considered new way. And that's because it still continues to stretch, it still continues to dip, splits, contortions of the arms, contortions of the backs, runway, everything is included in this one little performance. Now, going into the year 2000 and I'd say 4, the next generation of children were coming forward, and this is what I was explaining earlier. The next generation coming forward